Lesson 24, Prophecy of Jesus' Return. In today's lesson we shall hear Jesus prophesy of his coming again to the earth in judgment. Though we may not understand all the details of this prophecy about Jesus coming again, he has given us enough knowledge to warn us and prepare us for his return. There are plenty of different interpretations of how these future events will unfold. There seems to be some confusion because many see the future coming of Christ as a singular event. However, a careful study of this passage and others in the New Testament will show us that the coming of Christ happens in successive stages. First, Jesus will commence the day of judgment on the earth with what the Bible calls the day of the Lord, by coming for his church. This is what is commonly called the rapture and is spoken of in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and alluded to by Jesus in John chapter 14. The rapture involves the removal of the church from the earth, and this will be followed by a period of God's judgment on the earth for 7 years, which is called the tribulation. The Great Tribulation will be the second half of this 7 years after the abomination of desolation. At the end of this 7-year tribulation period, Jesus will return with his people to overthrow the enemies of Israel. This is the second coming of Christ, and every eye shall see him coming on the clouds and with great glory. He will return to the Mount of Olives and will establish his kingdom, ruling and reigning from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. This is a quick overview of the future prophetic calendar as it relates to the stages of Christ coming again to judge the world. In Matthew 24, when the disciples asked Jesus about the end of the age and his coming again, Jesus provided them with much detail. This detail is primarily concerned with the 7-year tribulation period when God will judge the nations and then rescue Israel from her enemies when he comes again in glory. This does not deal with the church or the rapture of the church, but it deals with the nation of Israel and the tribulation period. We will not have time to cover all the specific details of Jesus' prophecy, but we can look at some of the interesting aspects of this prophecy and find things to help us identify when these things will take place. Jesus mentions that false messiahs will appear at that time. Messiah is the word for Christ, which means anointed one. And we hear plenty of preachers today talking about being anointed of God. This may indicate what Jesus meant by these false messiahs who are claiming to be God's messengers today. Likely this is referring to men during the future tribulation who will arise claiming to be God's anointed. There are many details mentioned about this tribulation period or events leading up to it, namely wars, famines, pestilence, and earthquakes, which are called the beginnings of sorrows. Today we are seeing these things happening increasingly around the globe. We know of great earthquakes taking thousands of lives in Haiti and China. The spread of disease and famine is also very prevalent in our world today. If these are just the beginning of sorrows, then when the full weight of God's judgment comes upon the world, it will be a time of great sorrow and horrific destruction. During the tribulation, the church has gone to heaven, and Israel becomes the focus of God's attention and interest, but they also are hated by all nations. We already see how many of the Arab nations despise Israel and want to destroy her. There has been tremendous persecution against the Jews in the past century, and this still continues today. This will only increase through the tribulation until all nations are against Israel and seek her destruction. There will be false prophets who deceive, and lawlessness will abound. Some will faithfully preach the gospel, and there will be something called the abomination of desolation. Many believe this to be the Antichrist setting himself up in the temple and calling himself God and requiring others to worship him. This happens at the midpoint of the tribulation and will bring upon the earth God's wrath in what is called the Great Tribulation. There will be death everywhere. The sun and moon will be darkened, stars will fall, and the powers of heaven shaken. We cannot tell exactly what all this will mean, but it is global and of such power and terror that even the heavens will shake. There will be a sign given in the heavens concerning the Son of Man, which means that Jesus is coming. The angels gather the elect. The fig tree, when it sprouts, tells us that summer is approaching. And Jesus said, "When we begin to see these signs taking place, we know that his coming is drawing near. Therefore we are warned to be watchful and wait for his coming. Though no one knows the day or the hour, we know he could come at any time." Those who claim to know are arguing with Jesus, who said, "You do not know." I think I would rather believe Jesus than those who think they are wiser than he is. Jesus said heaven and earth would pass away, but his words would never pass away. Jesus said the coming day of judgment would happen like it did in the days of Noah. Everyone was just eating and drinking and living their lives without any concern for God's coming judgment. But then, in one day, the flood hit them, and they had no time to react, and they were all swept away in God's wrath. The wise servant of Jesus will be waiting and watching for his return, and busy himself in looking after his master's household. Those who care for God's people, feeding them the Word of God, will be rewarded when the Lord comes again. But those who do evil will be cut in pieces and left with hypocrites to suffer agony and weeping in hell. Jesus said, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." Matthew chapter 24, verse 35.